Hello, everybody. This is Joseph P. Farrell, and we're doing a little webinar today on the King of Instruments, all about pipe organs and a little bit of biography. This is as requested by some of our website members, and also it's in aid of a project that someone else has decided to launch. I hope eventually you'll be hearing about that, but this is in aid of that project as well. Now, what I'm going to do in this little short webinar about pipe organs, which of course is the instrument I grew up playing, is I'm going to give you an overview of the presentation. We're first going to start off with some personal notes. How did I get interested in pipe organs and so on? Who did I learn from? What instruments did I practice on secondly? And then thirdly, we're going to talk about what they are. What do all of that confusion of buttons and pistons and pedals and expression pedals and knobs and dials and everything else? It looks like an airline console. But what does all that mean? And how do you manage to keep track of it all? So we're going to be talking about what pipe organs are. And under that particular third part, we're going to be talking about the parts of a pipe, the nomenclature of different kinds of pipes, and then we're going to talk about different types of pipes. The pipes that you see are not the only types of pipe that there are in a pipe organ. In fact, some of them are very, very weird looking once you get back into the actual pipe room itself and take a look at some of them. And then thirdly, we're going to talk about divisionalization, or the names of the different keyboards. Each keyboard on a pipe organ has a name, and we're going to be discussing that. Then we're going to talk about unified ranks. What are unified ranks? Those are peculiar to a special kind of pipe organ called a theater organ. These were the large pipe organs that were put in the big movie palaces back during the day of the silent film to accompany the film with music. And theater organs were designed to be very, very versatile, as we're going to see, and one of the chief means of achieving that versatility was the so-called unified rank. So we're going to talk about what those are. Then we're going to have a look at the stops themselves. What do the numbers on the stops mean? We're going to talk about ranks. And again, we're going to talk about the harmonic series because, as you might have guessed, those numbers on the organ stops are actually indications of fundamentals and harmonic overtones in the harmonic series. So this is very crucial. If you are a pipe organist, you learn about the harmonic series because you live with it in your instrument in a very major way. And in fact, the pipe organ is really the only instrument until the more recent synthesizer, and with a few other exceptions in classical instruments such as the sitar and so on, that really takes full advantage of the harmonic series. Then we're going to talk about key and pedal action, because believe it or not, there are different kinds of ways of connecting the keyboard or the pedal board to the actual pipe valve itself. And depending on what the action of a pipe organ is, the organist has to tailor his playing and his interpretation of various pieces accordingly. Then we're going to look at combinations, pistons, and expression pedals, the other buttons and knobs that you find on a more modern pipe organ console. And then finally, we're going to have a look at some famous organs, not all of them obviously, but a few famous instruments, including some of my particular favorites, one in particular that we're going to be talking about. We're going to talk about various builders, not again at any length, but just to give you an idea of who some of the more famous builders were. One in particular we're going to spend some time with. We're going to talk about a few composers for the instrument and just a little bit about the kind of music that they wrote for the organ. All right, so let's begin with the first point in our outline, the personal notes. Now here you see me when I was a boy. As you can tell, I'm dressed in my Sunday best. This is how my folks used to dress me up when we went to church on Sunday. I always wore a hat, and you can tell I'm still fixated with hats because I still wear them. But in any case, when I was a boy, we went to church on a fairly regular basis to the First Methodist Episcopal Church in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. That's a picture of it right there at 12th and Spring in Sioux Falls. It's a Byzantine-style church, if you note the architecture. It even has a big dome that you can barely see. It's kind of obscured by that cloud. The dome is white. But it has a big Byzantine-style dome. And when I went to church with my parents, I used to beg them not to ship me off to Sunday school, but rather to let me attend adult church. And then on the occasions that they let me do this, I'd insist that they sit in the balcony behind the organ so that I could watch the organist and listen. And for me, it was a magical and sublime and very beautiful experience to my mind. And I determined at a very early age that this was just totally cool and that I wanted to play one. Now, music ran very strong in my family on my mother's side. My grandmother, Helen Hazlitt, who's pictured at the left, had studied piano in a conservatory and played classical music. And I can remember as a very young boy on a vacation once out to Oregon to their little house, she had a piano, a little kind of spinet piano in her home. And she played a little bit of some Beethoven sonatas, and I remember that very vividly. And she also occasionally played the piano at theaters during the silent era, and particularly during the Great Depression, to earn a little extra money. So she was a very accomplished musician. Now, my mother, pictured on the right, inherited this gift. She played our little spinet organ at home all the time, and she played entirely by ear. She didn't read music. She could read music, but she didn't read it with any facility. She just found it much easier to listen to a piece of music and sit down and play it, which she did, which was always kind of amazing to me. But regardless of what piece of music she would hear, she would always play it in the key of D major, and I remember that very vividly as well. This picture was taken, incidentally, when I was in college, just started in college in 1976, and at that time I was still playing the organ fairly regularly. Now, I started taking organ lessons when I was 6 years old, and I played my first professional time for my youngest sister Jeannie's wedding when I was 9 years old on the pipe organ at First Methodist Church in Sioux Falls. And I was so young at the time, I could barely reach the pedals. Now, my first organ teacher, Mrs. Connie Warren, worked with me in the church organist at the time, and we pulled it off. I played an adaptation of Richard Wagner's The Evening Star, which was a piece that my sister really liked and wanted played at her wedding. So that was my first experience in professional organ playing. It wasn't the last by any stretch of the imagination, but it certainly was the first. And again, it kind of reinforced, even though I was playing a little electronic Hammond spinet organ at home, it reinforced my desire to get onto a pipe organ as soon as possible. I quickly outgrew that little home spinet organ, and by the 8th grade, First Methodist Church had a new organist, and I have to tell you, he was just really good. He was a superb organist. In fact, during some National American Guild of Organists contests one year, he actually placed second in the nation. So he was a very accomplished organist. Now, by that time, Mrs. Warren had died, and I had a new organ teacher. We didn't get along very well at all, to be quite frank with you. And I begged my folks to let me take lessons on a pipe organ with the new organist if he'd let me. And he did, and that began a friendship, really, that lasted until he died in 1985 during my first year at Oxford University. And his name was Dennis Joel Hochhalter. He grew up in a little town in South Dakota called Tripp, and in that little town, he was surrounded by Germans. His parents obviously were German. He didn't speak a word of English until he was 5 years old, but he was a very accomplished musician, had studied with Dr. Gerhard Kropf at the University of Iowa for some time. And of course, Kropf at that time was a relatively well-known organ professor and organist. Now, Dennis was the consummate musician and teacher. He was really a mentor in many ways. He insisted I learn everything that I could about classical music. In other words, he didn't just teach me the organ. He exposed me to a wide range of music, of different styles and of interpretation of particular pieces, different artists, and so on and so forth. But of course, obviously, the organ was at the center of it. But we would meet quite often in his home with his wife. He'd play a piece of orchestral music. He had a gigantic record collection and an almost equally gigantic collection of orchestral scores. And he'd bring out these scores, put on a piece of music, and make me follow the scores. And he'd know if I was following or not if I turned the page of the score at the right time. So it was a rather intense period, but it was very enjoyable. We would meet for lessons at various pipe organs around the Sioux Falls area. And I have to tell you an anecdote about Dennis while I'm at it. He oftentimes would play a piece of music that we were learning, and he would transcribe music at sight. And I remember one, you know, if it was written in the key of A, he'd transcribe it to G or D or so on and so forth. I remember one time he sat down and transcribed a piece of music in a different key in each hand and the feet all at the same time. So he was a very accomplished musician. But anyway, like I say, around Sioux Falls, we traveled around various organs around the city and in the region. Calamity Jane was the name that we eventually gave the old organ at the First Methodist Episcopal Church there in Sioux Falls. It was just a disaster of a pipe organ. It really wasn't a very good pipe organ. And in fact, it's so bad that the church eventually replaced it. The instrument that's there now is not the one that I first played for my sister's wedding. I played a number of other church organs around the Sioux Falls area. Brandon Lutheran Church had a little two-manual Nordley tracker. John Nordley is a local, or at that time was a local Sioux Falls organ builder. He built entirely nothing but tracker organs, and we're going to figure out what a tracker is later, because that's very important to how you play certain types of organ music. I played a variety of other churches in Sioux Falls. We'll get back to one of them, St. Mary's Church. And I have to tell you a story about falling off the organ bench once when I was practicing. Because I'm so tall, I had to have bench lifters. And the bench lifters at St. Mary's Church were warped. So in other words, you'd be sitting there, and if you weren't careful, the bench would rock back and forth. And on one occasion, I was playing and really getting into it, and of course, the organ bench fell off the lifters, and I crashed into the pedal board, creating a giant ruckus of noise. Monsignor Sullivan came roaring out of the office into the church sanctuary, and I won't even repeat what he said, but he wasn't very pleased, needless to say. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, as we're going to see, I played a variety of instruments when I was in graduate school. One of them was at St. John's Episcopal Church. The organist there was kind enough to let me practice on the instrument, and he later moved to Holy Family Cathedral in Sioux Falls, or pardon me, in Tulsa, and I followed him there to Holy Family Cathedral. And as a matter of fact, shortly after the webmaster here, Daniel Degree, and I met in a music store, I invited him over to a practice session, so he actually did hear me practice when I was already starting to get out of practice at Holy Family Cathedral in Tulsa. That was in the early 90s. But anyway, one of my favorite instruments, and one of the instruments that Dennis set me to play, set me up to practice on a regular basis, was this instrument here. This is the Schlicker organ of Our Savior's Lutheran Church in Sioux Falls. You can kind of, if you look carefully over here, you can kind of see the organ console. This was a 3-manual 34 rank organ, so it was a kind of a medium-large organ. It was a very substantial instrument, very nice instrument. This was my favorite organ to practice on in Sioux Falls. Good acoustics, nice instrument. The church was kind enough to let me practice after hours. I'd lock up the doors and everything after I got done. On one occasion, when I first started practicing there, I didn't realize that the church had a live-in organist, and it was about 11:30 in the evening, and I was still practicing and carrying on. And there was no light in the entire sanctuary other than the sanctuary light up by the altar and the little console light on the organ console. And then I felt this finger quietly touching me on my shoulders. And of course, that scared me half to death because I was playing some kind of sepulchral organ music on top of everything else. And I flew off the organ bench. Rather nervous, but it was the janitor wondering when I was going to leave, and I didn't realize that they had a live-in janitor, so I left. But anyway, the largest instrument I ever practiced on, and at the time it was the largest tracker organ in the United States, and again we'll get back to what a tracker organ is, was this 4-manual 60-plus rank instrument at Christ Chapel in Oral Roberts University in Tulsa, Oklahoma. This was built by Larry Phelps. This was the last big instrument that Phelps built before he died. He was still working on this instrument when I arrived at ORU. And I met him, I introduced myself to him, and asked him if he would permit me to practice on the organ. And he said, certainly, you know, and he talked me into helping him voice pipes on occasion so that he wouldn't have to run back and forth to the keyboard when he was voicing the pipe. So it was an arrangement that carried on very nicely. I continued practicing on this instrument for about a year after he left. Eventually the music department at ORU kicked me off, and that's when I went to St. John's Episcopal Church. Now, one final little bit of personal information, anecdotal information, is you'll notice that I started playing the organ right off the bat. I didn't start with piano and then, so to speak, graduate to the organ. And I insisted on this as a kid because I had known enough about music, organ music at that time, to realize that pianos weren't around when organ music was being composed. And I approached a professor once in college asking for organ lessons, and he kind of looked down his nose at me and said, "Have you had piano?" And I replied, "Well, no, I haven't had piano." And he said, "Well, I consider piano paramount to playing the organ well." And I just kind of looked back at him and I said, "Oh, really? What did Johann Sebastian Bach use?" And of course, Bach didn't use a piano because they hadn't been invented yet. The keyboard instruments at that time were, of course, the organ, clavichord, and the harpsichord. Now, why am I bringing the harpsichord into this? Well, you've heard me tell many times in these webinars, vid chats, and so on, of my visit when I was in Oxford to the Goebel harpsichord shop. That should be G-O-B-E-L, not Goebbels, like the German propaganda minister. But I visited his harpsichord shop, and Mr. Goebel was very gracious and showed me around. He was busy building a replica of the harpsichord that you see there in that picture, which is probably the largest Baroque-era harpsichord ever built. It was built by Hieronymus Haas in Hamburg, Germany. As you can see, it's a triple or a 3-manual harpsichord. It's an enormous and enormously powerful instrument. This harpsichord was owned by the famous French harpsichordist Raphael Pugliana, who you see there in that picture. This is an enormous harpsichord. Well, the reason I'm bringing harpsichords into this is because, of course, this was the instrument that organists would have, if they could afford one, in their home. And oftentimes this was a pedal harpsichord with a pedal board, just like on a pipe organ, that would allow them to practice the organ music on the harpsichord. Now, there's two reasons they did this. Number one, the touch of a harpsichord and a tracker organ is very, very similar in some respects. There's kind of a snap to the key that's very different from a piano keyboard or a modern electronic keyboard. There's a kind of a little resistance that you overcome when you first depress the key. And the other reason is, of course, if you practice the organ back in those days, you'd have to pay somebody to come, or usually 2 or 3 people on a larger instrument, to come in and pump the bellows for you while you were playing the instrument. Some churches had their pipe organs rigged up to water wheels, which would turn the bellows and pump the bellows automatically, but those were few and far between. So harpsichords were the instrument of choice. This is what you learned the organ on. So it wasn't piano. And I'm kind of a stickler for this because pianos, in my opinion, have tended to muddy in a very subtle way people that go from piano to the organ. I think the organ is its own keyboard instrument. It needs to be treated as such. You should learn the organ in its own right. You should learn the harpsichord in its own right. And of course, piano. But there are certain technical things of technique that organists do that pianists won't often do. So it does change the way you play, and I'm very grateful that I have had the opportunity to start directly on the organ. So let's go to the third and most lengthy part of this little webinar. What exactly is a pipe organ? Well, a pipe organ basically is nothing but a big set of very large to very small and very loud to very soft whistles that are activated by keyboards and a pedal board. And those whistles, that instrument, that machine, relies upon, and this is a very crucial point as we're going to see later on in this section, it relies upon and exploits the phenomenon of the harmonic series to the hilt, utilizing an entire building as its sound box to mix the longitudinal waves produced by said whistles in all their possible combinations. In effect, a pipe organ is simply a large analog synthesizer. And it's also unique amongst instruments because in a certain sense, the listener is actually sitting inside the instrument rather than outside of it. Because again, the building itself is the soundboard. So this is something to keep in mind. The harmonic series is exploited by the pipe organ in a way that virtually no other instrument parallels. And this exploitation accounts for the very rich sound that a pipe organ has, because when you mix all those sounds of all those whistles together, you create a very, very unique modulated waveform in the building itself. So let's look at pipes for a moment. Over there on the right side of your screen, you'll see three shapes, three basic pipe shapes. You'll see on the left, the two left pipes there are your standard metal pipe that you often see on the front of pipe organs, although more recently pipe organ builders have started putting the wooden pipes right out into the open so that you can actually see the different kinds of pipes that are usually hidden back in the pipe room. On the right, you'll see what's called a reed pipe. Now, if you look here for a moment, this is very important. You'll notice the toe, that's where the pipe actually sits in the wind chest. Then the foot of the pipe where the air is introduced. Then the mouth of the pipe, which has a little lip on the inside of the pipe. And then this lower lip and this upper lip are positioned very precisely so that the airflow through this little aperture hits this upper tongue. Part of the air goes this way and part of the air goes that way. And what this does is it sets up turbulence in the air, which creates a standing wave, a longitudinal acoustical standing wave in the body of the pipe or the resonator of the pipe. This is the part of the pipe that actually produces the sound that you hear. Now, this is also the part of the pipe when you look at a stop, and I put a couple stop names over here that you might encounter on a typical Baroque era organ. A Bourdon 32-foot or a Rohrflöte 8-foot. What those numbers are telling you is that that is the fundamental length of the resonator in feet. Please notice, pipe organ stops are not metric. Okay, that's a very important point here. This is the length of the pipe in feet at the lowest note on the keyboard. All right, so in other words, if you press the low C on the keyboard, pulling the Rohrflöte 8-foot, what you're hearing is an 8-foot long resonating cavity. Now, there's going to be some exceptions to the rule that we're going to get to later on. Obviously, a Borden 32 is going to be a very long, tall pipe, very fat, very thick, and the note it produces is going to be very, very low. All right? The higher the number, the lower the sound. The lower the number, the higher the sound. That's basically what we're going to see later on. But that's kind of a basic introduction to how pipes are constructed. You'll notice that these little reeds here in the reed pipe produce the sound very differently by vibrating the reed against the tongue, very much like a woodwind instrument, like a clarinetist would do. All right? Now, with that in mind, let's talk about the other way that pipes are classified. And there's basically 4 types of pipes that produce 4 types of sound. There's the principals, which is, for want of a better expression, the standard or typical organ sound. Then you would have flutes, and the sound they produce are rather obvious by the name. Then you have strings. These are actually a reed pipe, but they're very, very soft in nature. They're a very soft sounding reed. Then you have the actual reeds themselves, things like oboes, trumpets, which are very bright, loud, and other reed types like bombards. The purpose of that stop will be rather obvious from the name. But these are the 4 types of pipes. It's rather similar in a way, but to the 4 divisions of a symphony orchestra. Many people think of them that way. They're not quite the same. They're not exclusively in different sections, because you'll find all types of pipes on the divisions of a pipe organ. So, with the mention of divisionalization, let's get down to brass tacks and talk about all those keyboards that you see on pipe organs. Now, the divisionalization means simply what the manual is, all right? And each manual of a pipe organ has its own name. And that name is going to vary depending on the era, the type of instrument you're dealing with, and the country you're in, all right? So, for example, on a small pipe organ of 2 manuals, the first manual, the lowest manual, in English would be called the Great. In German, it would be called the Hauptwerk, and in Dutch, the Hoofdwerk. The second manual, the upper manual, would be called the Swell, and the reason for that term we'll be getting into later on, or the Positief, which is a softer but slightly brighter sound. Now, Swell and Great are names that you'll start to encounter in pipe organs beginning in the late 19th century. Prior to this, these Baroque era names, Positief, Hauptwerk, Hoofdwerk, would be more common. Now, when you get to larger pipe organs, and I have to disabuse people of a certain notion that many people have. Many people have the idea that organs are typically 2 manual instruments, and anything bigger than that is overkill. Well, in actual fact, most organs are actually 3 manual instruments. And the reason for this is that most organ literature is best played on a 3 manual instrument. 4 manuals, of course, is a fairly large instrument, and as we're going to see, there can be many, many more keyboards on a pipe organ. Now, again, the divisionalization of these different manuals is set up in a particular order. On a 3 or 4 manual instrument, the lowest keyboard is always going to be the Positief, or sometimes it's called the Rückpositief, and we're going to see why that name appears, particularly on German and Dutch instruments. And sometimes on more modern instruments, it's called the choir, all right? The second or middle manual on a 3 manual instrument, or the second manual on a 4 manual instrument, is again the Hauptwerk, or the Hoofdwerk, or the Great, or the Grand Orgue in French. Now, in France, as we're going to see, this arrangement differs because in the 19th century, a very famous French organ builder switched the order of the keyboards and put the Grand Orgue always on bottom, since The grand orgue is what organists play the most, all right? And then from there, it went up to the choir, or the recite in French. And then the third manual on a standard organ is the Oberwerk, Bovenwerk in Dutch, the swell on a modern English or American instrument, and on a French instrument, the recite. On a four-manual work organ, you would have the Brustwerk or the Borstwerk in Dutch. On French Romantic American organs, the bombard. And again, the purpose of the division is rather evident from the name. All right. Now, I want to point out something about the swell and the choir. Oftentimes on modern instruments, these divisions are what are called under expression. On a Baroque or classical era instrument, all manuals are not under expression, and we're going to find out what that means later on. All right. Now, while we're talking about ranks, we have to understand what a rank is, their relationship to stops, and why theater organs appear to have so many stops. A rank of pipes is like a choir of strings on a piano or a harpsichord. So in other words, one stop will control one rank of pipes, period. Now, that's not always the case, but in most instances on most Baroque, classical, Romantic, and modern era standard pipe organs, this is the case. There are certain little exceptions that you learn as you go along when you start learning the organ. But as I said, for most organs, most stops control one rank of pipes, and that stop is designed to produce a particular sound. Each manual or each division controls certain sets of stops, and that's what we have been calling divisionalization. And each division has slightly different functions. As I said, the Rook positif or the positif is a fairly bright but softer manual. The Great or the Hauptwerk is the standard manual, that's the noisy one. The swell is a more expressive manual, or the Oberwerk is a more expressive manual. The Brustwerk or Bovenwerk, or so on and so forth. All of those upper divisions on 4 or 5 manual instruments have their own specialized functions, rather like each set of components in a symphony orchestra, woodwinds, brass, and so on. But on theater organs, all ranks are unified. So on all pipe organs, with the exception of theater organs, you're dealing with straight ranks. In other words, one stop on one division controlling one rank of pipes. But on theater organs, all manual divisions can play all stops. So in other words, on a theater organ, the reason why you see so many stops is that all the stops are reproduced for each division of the organ console itself. Each stop can be played from any manual, essentially. So in a sense, theater organs are the most versatile of all types of pipe organs for that reason, because they give organists an unprecedented ability for creativity and flexibility. Now, get my mouse to work for me. Now let's stop and look at some real nitty-gritty here. Let's look at stops, the numbers on stops and what they mean, the ranks, and the harmonic series. When you look at an organ console, regardless of what type of stop you're looking at, draw knobs, tilt tabs, and so on and so forth, all the stops will have the name of the rank of the pipe, and most organists will get familiar, very quickly with what each name does, what it sounds like, basically. And then beneath that name, there will be a number. Most often, you'll see a number in the form of 64, 32, 16, 8, 4, 2, and 1 feet. And again, that's the length of the resonating body in the pipe. Now, obviously, a 64-foot pipe is a very rare stop, and it's also a very, very low stop. It's at the extreme low end of human hearing. A 1-foot stop, on the other hand, is at the very upper register of human hearing. So in other words, As I said, the pipe organ exploits the harmonic series to the hilt. It exploits the entire range of human hearing. Now, there's a little exception that we have to take note of here, and those are pipes that are called gedacht or gedeckt, all right? And you'll oftentimes see those names on the stop itself. What that means is that the top of the pipe has been capped. And what that means is, in turn, that the resonating cavity, let's say the resonating cavity, if it were open, were 8 feet. But if you cap it, you're actually doubling the length that the air has to travel. So in effect, you've created a 16-foot pipe in an 8-foot space. So this is one way that organ builders have gotten around limited size and so on and so forth if they need to create deeper, more resonant pipes, but they don't have the height to build it. So in other words, you can cap a 16-foot pipe and you'll have a 32-foot fundamental tone that's produced. Now, those are the fundamental tones, and we're going to get to what they do in a moment. Then there's stops that are called mutations. And when you look at a mutation stop, you'll always see some fraction. And the fractions you will encounter the most are thirds and fifths. You'll see mutation stops of 2 2/3 feet, 2 1/3 feet, 1 1/3, 2 3/5, 2 and so on and so forth. Now, what a mutation does is something very interesting. And again, we're going to see what that does once we look at a keyboard and actually see what stops do. Then the third type of stop is called a mixture. Now, mixtures, you'll notice, have Roman numerals. And mixtures are a stop that actually are the only kind of stop that control several ranks at the same time. And the Roman numeral tells you how many ranks are actually engaged when you pull that stop. So in other words, a mixture with a Roman numeral 3 tells you that that particular mixture has 3 ranks sounding simultaneously when you pull that stop. Mixtures are used for very bright effects, all right? They live in the upper registers of pipe organs, and they give extreme clarity to notes. Now, the fourth kind of stop that you're going to find on more modern instruments beginning in the Baroque era. Prior to the Baroque era, these stops did not exist. These are called couplers, all right? And as the name suggests, what a coupler allows you to do is to play one division from another division. So in other words, if you have a coupler that says Hauptwerk to pedal, that means that any stops that you have pulled on the Hauptwerk division, the second manual in a 3-manual organ, are also going to sound when you play a pedal note, all right? So in addition to whatever stops you've got drawn on the pedal board, you're also adding the stops that you have drawn on the Hauptwerk. You'll see other types of couplers, positive to Hauptwerk, and so on. Now, on more modern instruments, you're going to see another kind of coupler. Let's look at these couplers, swell to great 16 and swell to great 4, all right? What swell to great 16 means is, again, all the stops that you have engaged on the swell manual are also going to be playable from the great manual. But because it's 16, all those stops that you have drawn on the swell manual are going to sound 1 octave lower when you play them on the great. And by the same token, if you pull swell to great 4, that means all the stops that you have on the swell manual are playable on the great manual, but they're going to sound 1 octave above the note that you're actually playing. Now, there's a final, very unique kind of coupler that's called a unison off. And what a unison off does, let's say you have swell to swell 4, all right? So in other words, you can couple a division to itself, and it's going to play all the stops you have drawn, not only at the 8-foot fundamental, but an octave above that at the 4-foot fundamental. What a unison off does is it turns off the 8-foot fundamental, so you can actually create some very interesting effects by using couplers and the unison off coupler, all right? Now, we're going to get to keyboards in a moment, because all of this may be sounding just a little too complicated, but I assure you it's really very, very simple once you see what's going on. But while we're talking about couplers, let's talk about one of my favorite movies of all time featuring creepy organ music, and that's The Ghost of Mr. Chicken. And you see a scene, one of the famous scenes from that movie. There's Don Knotts staring in disbelief at the organ in the Simmons mansion as the organ supposedly is playing by itself, being played by the ghost that murdered his wife. All right. Now, why am I bothering you with this? Well, if you've seen the movie, it's because you find out that one of Don Knotts' friends has actually been playing the organ from what's called a tuning keyboard in the pipe room itself. Now, on mechanical instruments, whenever you play one keyboard that's coupled to another division, the keys of that division will also move even though you're not touching them because they're all coupled mechanically. So in other words, a tuning keyboard coupled from someplace else to the main keyboard is going to depress the keys, and poor Don Knotts, not being an organist, didn't know that. So anyway, thanks to Vic Mizzy there for providing some entertaining, creepy organ music. If you don't know who Vic Mizzy is, he's also the fellow that wrote the theme song for the Addams Family and Green Acres. So anyway, now getting back to stops. If you look at stops, there are also on occasion special effects stops, like the tremulant or tremolo, and that's the stop that produces a vibrating pitch rather than a steady pitch. And that's very, very typical, in fact, on theater organs. And in the Baroque era, you'll not only find a tremolo, you'll find sometimes on some larger instruments a stop called the Cymbelstern, which is simply a little collection of bells with a rotating hammer that goes around and strikes these tinkly little bells. And in addition to all of that, on theater organs, there's a special treat, and I love this. There's something called the toy box. And you see a picture right there on the right side of the screen of an actual theater organ toy box. The toy box can include things like bells, chimes, gunshots, slide whistles, ooga horns, gongs, drums, pianos, you name it. Cymbals. You can see the cymbals here, the drums, the tambourine, and so on and so forth. So you can have a lot of fun with the theater organ toy box. And again, the reason that they had this on those big movie palace pipe organs was simply because the organist would have to accompany, sometimes with sound effects, to the movie. And that was their way of mechanizing the whole process from the console. So let's look at stops now, because this is where the rubber meets the road. On the screen, you see a keyboard. It's actually a little shorter than the standard pipe organ keyboard. Usually a pipe organ keyboard goes about 5 octaves from low C, all right? So now I want you to pretend that this note C right here is the low end of the keyboard, all right? And let's say you've pulled an 8-foot stop. So if you press that low C, that 8 feet is telling you that that pipe is going to be 8 feet long from the lip to the top of the pipe, all right? If you press a 4-foot stop and play this note, the note that actually sounds is going to be this note up here, even though you're pressing this one down here. And if you pull the 8 and 4-foot stop together, if you press this note, and this note are going to play. By the same token, if you pull a 16-foot stop and play this note, the note that actually sounds is this note. If you pull an 8-foot stop and a 16-foot stop, then this note sounds and that note sounds. And if you pull 3 stops, 16, 8, and 4, then all 3 of these notes are going to sound. And then the 2-foot stop will be up here, and the 1-foot stop will be up here. So with that in mind, now let's talk about mutations. Remember the mutation stops with the fractions, thirds and fifths, all right? When you pull a mutation stop, what's going to happen And the mutations, you'll note, are usually in the upper registers, all right? If you pull a mutation stop, what's going to happen is rather than hitting the same note an octave above or an octave below or 2 octaves above or 2 octaves below, what you're going to be hitting is the harmonic of that note, say, for example, the note E or the note G. So let's say you've pulled 16/8/4 and a mutation, and you're playing this note, this note, this note, and the note E, all right? So in other words, what pipe organs are doing, by playing one note, you're actually playing a whole range of instruments. You're deliberately manipulating the harmonic series. And the more stops, the richer the sound. And the reason why the sound is richer is you're adding more and more overtones in the harmonic series to the fundamental note that you're playing. This is why the pipe organ is so rich. When you add mixtures to that, then you're adding several ranks playing on one note at the same time with all the other stops that you have pulled. Now add couplers to that, and which you can do the same thing on any manual that we've been doing here on this one, and couple what you've been doing on that manual down here to this one, and the sound becomes even richer and, incidentally, louder. All right? So in other words, it's a big, huge analog synthesizer. That's really all these things are. Now, with that in mind, let's talk about another thing that you have to know before you sit down and rip off a piece of music on a pipe organ, and that's key action. In other words, what is the mechanism that makes the pipe valve open when you depress a key? And there's 4 basic types of key action. Obviously, in the Baroque era and the Classical era, all the action from the key to the pipe was mechanical. That's called tracker action. Now, this is very interesting because tracker action actually allows the organist to control the amount of attack on the initial sounding of the note, or the chiff. If you hit the key hard and fast, it's going to produce a much more profound chiff sound. It's like popping your plosives when you speak English. I'm emphasizing the P sound. Well, that's what you're doing when you hit the key on a tracker harder. The chiff is much more pronounced. If, on the other hand, you press it slowly and deliberately, the chiff is less pronounced. So an organist playing a tracker can actually control the articulation of the individual notes, much the same way a pianist can control the loudness of the attack depending on how hard he strikes the key and how hard the hammer hits the string. Now, this is very interesting because obviously on a tracker organ, when the organist is depressing the key, he's having to overcome the air pressure and the valve mechanism itself. So in other words, the more stops you pull and the more manuals you couple, the pressure on the keyboard that you have to exert becomes more profound. So playing a loud piece of music for 10 or 15 minutes on a tracker organ can be quite a physical workout. You literally have to have very, very strong hands once you get into practice on these organs. Later on, pneumatic action was used. So in other words, the thing controlling the opening and closing of the pipe valve itself was actually more air. Air was being used to open the valve and air was being used to close it. And again, that allowed you a little bit of ability, not quite as much as on a tracker, to control that initial chiff. Now, by the modern 20th century, obviously, electronic action is the most associated with pipe organs. In other words, the keyboard is reduced to nothing but a set of telegraphs to the whistles. There's no chiff, there's no difference of how hard or soft you depress the key. The pipe is either simply on or off, all right? Now, most modern organs have an action that's called electro-pneumatic. This is a kind of action that combines pneumatic and electrical action, and it does allow you to get a kind of a fake chiff. You cannot control it, but it does give you a little bit of an attack on the initial sounding of a note. Now, with that in mind, there's one final kind of action that you will encounter on theater organs, and only on theater organs, because theater organs are, of course, all electrical action. This kind of action is called double touch or second touch. And what this does is the key that you depress on the console goes down a certain length or distance, and that engages a certain number of stops that you've pulled or registered. But if you put a little extra oomph, the key will depress a little further and engage more stops that you've specially prepared for that purpose. It adds a little oomph to the double touch, and that is very crucial in theater organ playing when you're trying to emphasize bass lines, rhythm, and so on and so forth. So that's something that theater organists almost uniquely and alone have to deal with in the keyboard world. Now, we're not even close to done yet, because if you look at a modern pipe organ, you'll see something else has appeared. If you follow the cursor over here, you'll see a bunch of knobs and buttons under each of the divisions of this instrument. Over here we have our stops, and each stop, of course, is divisionalized. This is probably the pedal division here, and then the swell, and so on and so forth. So all the stops are arranged by the divisions that they operate with. These knobs up here, these tilt tabs, are probably all the couplers on it. But what are these buttons? What are these toe pistons that surround the pedal board down here? Those are called combinations, all right? And we're going to see the fellow that invented these things and gave rise to the modern pipe organ in just a minute. What combinations allow the organist to do is they can preset by holding the button in and pulling a number of stops. Once they've figured out and got all the stops they want, they release the button. That is now an analog memory in the organ itself. So simply pressing that button will engage all those stops that you've just registered in each one of these little knobs. So this is a mechanism that allows the organist to change several stops very quickly and all at once. All right. Now, these combinations themselves can come in two forms. They can be divisionalized. In other words, this set of buttons over here is probably for this lower division on this organ. The mid set of buttons are probably generals, which affect all the divisions on the organ. And the toe pistons are just like these little finger pistons up here on the keyboards. The toe pistons do exactly the same thing. They allow the organist, by hitting the button with his feet, to change several stops in a division or on the whole organ all at once. All right, that's what combinations do. Now, finally, you'll notice another thing on modern organs that you would not have had on a Baroque organ, and that's these foot pedals here that look like accelerator pedals in an automobile or a truck. By depressing these things, any division up here, let's say you're playing the swell, the third manual here, the middle manual, which is probably this pedal here, the middle pedal. As you depress that pedal, the swell manual is in, the pipes for the swell manual is in a box called a swell box. It's a little kind of specially constructed room, at the front of which are levers that are rather like large Venetian blinds. So when you depress the swell pedal, the blinds or the shutters on the swell box open up and allow the sound to come out more clearly. When you pull back on the expression pedal, those levers close and the sound gets softer. So in other words, this mechanism allows the organist to gradually increase or decrease the loudness or softness of a particular division. All right. Now, there's another pedal over here on the very right. Usually that pedal is a crescendo pedal. And again, this is a pedal that allows you, by depressing it, to engage all the stops of the organ from the softest to the loudest stops in the organ. And when it's fully depressed, all the stops on the organ are usually engaged. So that's another way of controlling expression. This simply is a way of adding or subtracting stops without having to pull individual stop knobs or rely on preset combinations in these buttons. So now just a few words about some of the famous builders. And again, there's so many that, I'm only going to be very, very lightly skipping over some of these builders, but we're going to spend some time with one particular builder in just a moment. But if you go back to the Baroque era, one of the most famous builders would have been Arp Schnitger. Another famous builder would have been Zilberman. As we're going to see in a moment, a very famous Dutch builder, Christian Miller. Skinner, the American builder Skinner, would be responsible for the sound that most Americans associate with the modern American pipe organ. Rufati in Italy is another modern pipe organ builder, very famous builder. There's a builder in Holland during the 1950s and 60s by the name of Flenthrop, who really began the revival in modern organ building of building all mechanical action tracker organs. And one of my favorite modern tracker builders was Lawrence Phelps, and I already told you I had played his biggest instrument at Oral Roberts University. Phelps combined both tracker action with the use of combination pistons and expression. So in other words, he built mechanical action instruments, but they were also instruments that used the more modern techniques and technologies for the control of stops and registration. Now, we need to spend some time with this fellow here. This is Aristide Cavaillé-Coll, the famous French organ builder, lived from 1811 to 1899. This is the man responsible for inventing the idea of combination pistons, of manuals under expression. All right, this is the man that more or less begins the transition from the Baroque organ to the modern instrument that we hear today. If you listen to a Cavaillé-Coll, you can tell that you're listening to a kind of transitional instrument. Most of the instruments he built were very, very big, and this inaugurated the French symphonic school of playing because his instruments were very large instruments capable of an extreme variety of expression. He also made another innovation in organ building in that his consoles were horseshoe shaped, and that of course becomes the shape identifiable with theater organs in the early 20th century. Now his instruments were so significant that they inspired a whole school of organ composition during the 19th century, largely in France, associated with names of some famous organ composers, César Franck, Charles-Marie Widor, Louis Vierne, Marcel Dupré, many other people were inspired by his instruments to create a kind of symphonic organ literature. Now, here is a picture of Cavaillé-Coll's biggest organ. This is the organ console of the Church of Saint-Sulpice de Paris. And as a matter of fact, you see there its most famous organist, Charles-Marie Widor, at the console. Widor was the organist there for several decades, beginning in the mid-19th century all the way up to the end of his life, shortly before World War II. So this man had an enormous influence on organ literature, particularly in the 19th century. He was also a member of the French Academy. He was very closely associated with very famous composers of the 19th century, Rossini, Tchaikovsky. Everybody that was in Paris and composing at that time knew Widor and vice versa. So let's look at some other famous instruments just very briefly, give you an idea of what you're dealing with or can deal with when you play a pipe organ. The largest church organ in the world is usually considered to be the organ of the Cathedral of Passau in Germany, and there's the console of the instrument. And again, you see a modern console with the combination pistons under the manuals, the toe studs, the expression pedals, and so on and so forth, tilt tabs, and so on. This is a very large instrument, and in fact, the various pipes for this particular organ are located all around the building, so you can get some very interesting physical effects bouncing things back and forth on this particular instrument. Now, the next organ is probably one of my all-time favorites. I grew up as a kid listening to this organ on recordings. This is the organ, a Baroque era organ. It's the Miller organ of the Bavokerk in Haarlem, Holland. And it's one of the largest Baroque era instruments in the world. It's a 3-manual instrument. And again, please understand, the number of manuals doesn't really have anything to do with size. It simply has to do with flexibility. This is about a 60-plus rank instrument on 3 manuals. It's a gigantic instrument. But the reason I'm including this picture here for you is so that you can see something about the way that a standard organ is built, and particularly in that era. Because, of course, on the sides you see these 2 enormous towers. These are actually the 32-foot pedal towers. And again, these are not capped pipes, so the fundamental here is about 32 feet in length, all right? Up here at the top of the organ case, you're going to have the Oberwerk, or the Bovenwerk, all right? That's the upper manual of the organ, and it's playing these pipes up here. The Hauptwerk, or in Dutch Hoofdwerk, is this part of the case right here, all of these pipes. So in other words, the physical case is actually correspondent to the divisions of the organ. Now the interesting thing here is this little case here in front. I want you to look at this very carefully, because the organ console itself sits behind this case and in front of the main case. So these pipes are actually, pardon me, physically behind the organist. This is the division, the bottom manual of the organ, pardon me, the Positiv, or in German, pardon me, in German, the Rückpositiv. Rückpositiv simply means the back positive. And that's simply a way of telling you that the Positiv is behind your back. Now, the interesting thing here is that the Positiv, because it sits physically closer to the people in the building, actually has kind of a more instant sound feel to it. So you can achieve certain interesting spatio-physical musical effects by bouncing between manuals from this part of the case to the Positiv. And of course, on some instruments, you actually have parts of the case at the other end of the church. Now, that's not possible on this organ, because this is, of course, a tracker organ. And the farther the case is from the keyboard, the stiffer the action is. This is why on these old instruments, the console is not a separate standing thing. It's built right into the organ case itself. Pardon me. Now, since we're talking about organ builders, we need to talk about this guy. This is Rudolf Wurlitzer, who founded the Wurlitzer Company, obviously. And it was, of course, Wurlitzer that made most of the theater organs that were in the big movie palaces during the silent film era, the so-called Mighty Wurlitzer. There were other builders that would build theater organs, Robert Morton, Hope Jones, Miller, and Kimball, but certainly Wurlitzer had by far and away the largest chunk of the business, and it probably produced the best theater organs that were out there. Now, here's a typical theater organ console, and again, you'll notice the horseshoe console that Kavaya Cole introduced, this time arranged with tilt tabs for the stops. And again, the reason why there's so many stops for relatively few ranks is, again, you're dealing with unified ranks. So every stop is playable from every division. And again, you've got your combination pistons, your expression pedals, and so on. Now, you'll notice that theater organs are often designated with this type of designation. The Roman numeral stands for how many manuals the theater organ would have, and the Arabic numeral stands for how many ranks are actually in the organ. 34 ranks is a fairly substantial medium to large size instrument. Theater organs, like all other kinds of organs, could be small with 2 manuals, 3 or 4, sometimes even 5 manuals. So they could be very large. The other interesting thing about theater organs is in the bigger movie palaces, these things, since they were connected electrically to the pipes, were often put on lifts or elevators that were down in the basement, and the organist would start playing, and the elevator would rise up into the actual theater itself as the organist was playing, and spotlights on him or her, and it was quite a theatrical show just with the organ itself. Now we need to mention a couple of other organs. This is the second largest organ in the world. This is the organ that is actually in the Wanamaker department store in Philadelphia. You can see part of the store here in the background. This is a very, very famous organ. It's still in use at the Wanamaker store, and it has no less than 6, that's right, count them, 6 keyboards and over 600, I think 650 stops with, again, the combination pistons, all the expression pedals, and so on and so forth. A gigantic console. But guess what? It's not the biggest. This is the console of the largest pipe organ in the world. It makes great use of unified ranks. It's not entirely unified like a theater organ, but it does use some unified ranks. This is the console of the Midlothian organ in the Boardwalk Hall in Atlantic City, New Jersey. This was built in the late 20s, early 30s. And it is widely regarded as being the largest pipe organ in the world. It's been in disrepair for quite some time, but as you can tell, this has, guess what, 7 keyboards, no less than 7. The top keyboard, you can kind of see the top of it here behind the music stand, but there they are, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And well over 1,000 stops in this big console. In fact, it's not a console. This thing is actually kind of a little room. It looks kind of like a gazebo that you actually go into because the console is so enormous. So with that in mind, just let's look very briefly at some of the more famous organ composers. By no means, again, a complete list. But I do want to talk about organ composers, because you may have heard some of these names and not realize that they have written anything for organ, and some of the names you may never have heard of before. One of the most famous organ composers, among many other types of music he wrote, was Dietrich Buxtehude, who lived from 1637 to 1707. This is supposedly a picture of him over here on the right part of your screen. And Buxtehude, as you can tell, he was a long hair, the first rock musician. He is also, if you want to be quite blunt about it, he's the Bach before Bach. And there's an interesting relationship, as a matter of fact, that Buxtehude has to Johann Sebastian Bach, because Buxtehude in his day was widely renowned throughout Northern Europe, Germany, Holland, Denmark, and so on, for being the foremost keyboardist, organist of the day, and the foremost composer of the day. And his renown was so great that when Johann Sebastian Bach was 20 years old, Bach was upset with his employer in southern Germany, and so he just simply told his employer that he was going on a short trip to listen to Buxtehude play and learn a few things from him. Well, Bach walked, when he was 20 years old, from 1705 to 1706, over 280 miles from southern Germany up to northern Germany to listen to Buxtehude play, and as a result was so enthralled he stayed there for about five to 6 months, of course ruining his employment with his employer before he returned. But there is a direct influence of Buxtehude on Bach, and you can hear it very definitely in the transition of Bach's early organ works that he had written on his own, and then he hears Buxtehude, and then you see him beginning to take off and get all sorts of wild ideas. Buxtehude's music is very enjoyable if you know which pieces to look and listen for. Obviously, the most famous organ composer, probably the most famous composer of all time, is Johann Sebastian Bach, and obviously, again, the organ was his instrument. And of course, he wrote the most famous organ composition, the Toccata and Fugue in D minor, which many people associate or call the Phantom of the Opera. but many, many other organ pieces besides that. That probably is one of my least favorite of his pieces. It's overplayed, kind of like Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. There's many, many other fine compositions. Now here's a fellow you probably didn't associate with organ music very much, and that's Georg Friedrich Händel, of course, the composer of the Messiah, known primarily in his day for his operas, but also Händel was a superb and very accomplished keyboardist and harpsichordist and organ at that time, and wrote a number of pieces for harpsichord and for organ, and his organ pieces were primarily in the form of organ concerti, which he would play quite often himself with the orchestra during intermission during his operas. They were sort of incidental music to transition between movements of his operas. One of the most famous of his organ concerti is a little piece called The Cuckoo and the Nightingale. Most of Händel's organ music is for manuals only, given the fact that the big organs were on the continent of Europe at the time. Now, another composer you probably don't associate very much with organ music is Joseph Haydn, who himself composed a small number, but very fine organ concertos. In my opinion, Haydn is a brilliant composer, but he did write for organ, and he did write other keyboard concertos as well, very nice ones, as a matter of fact. Now, here's one you definitely don't associate with organ music, and that's Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. Now, Mozart didn't compose very much for organ. He did do a little composition for the organ, but whew, what he did compose for the organ is breathtaking. One piece in particular, a very famous one, is the Titanic, and it's also titanically difficult fantasy in F minor, Köchel number 608. He originally wrote this for a mechanical organ, but he allegedly played this piece on the Miller organ at the Bavo-Kerk, that beautiful Dutch Baroque instrument I showed you earlier, because he did play that instrument. He made a little tour of Holland and visited many of the famous pipe organs in that country. And allegedly he is supposed to have played that Fantasia himself on the Bavo-Kerk organ. And I can tell you, it's just an enormous titanic piece of music, and it is hugely difficult. When you listen to it the first time, you wouldn't believe that you're hearing Mozart until you get to the middle of the piece. Now, another composer that you may not have heard of is César Franck, very famous Romantic composer in the Romantic era. 1811 to 1899. The piece that started off the French symphonic movement was in fact written and composed by César Franck, and that was called the Grande Pièce de Symphonique. And this is, again, a very large piece of music. It's very moody. In places it's very dark and brooding, but at the same time it's peculiarly lyrical. He is the guy, and that is the particular piece that started off that whole French symphonic school of organ composition. Now, here's one of my favorites, Charles-Marie Widor. Again, this guy was very long-lived, 1844 to 1937. And he's easily and by far and away the most famous of the French symphonists. You've seen this picture before in this little webinar. That's him there at the console of Saint-Sulpice de Paris. He wrote altogether a set of 10 organ symphonies, Opus 13, numbers 1 through 4, and then Opus 42, numbers 5 through 8, and then 2 final organ symphonies based on Roman Catholic plain chant, the Symphonie Gothique, and then the Symphonie Romane. He also edited, along with Albert Schweitzer, who was one of his organ pupils, he edited a critical edition of all of J.S. Bach's organ music. I like that edition personally because it's very clean. The page turns in the scores are nicely placed and so on. That's the edition I grew up using. It does have a few problems, but all in all, it's an easy edition to use. Perhaps his most famous organ symphonies would be the 5th, the 6th, and the 9th, the Symphonie Gothique. Now, one of his students was a fellow by the name of Louis Vierne, the celebrated blind organist of Notre Dame. He was born in 1870, died the same year as Widor, his mentor and professor. He composed various pieces for the organ, including 6 organ symphonies of his own. They become progressively more modern in their harmonies as you go along. But Viern's organ symphonies, along with Widor's, are some of the most difficult in the literature. They're the organ equivalent of a Chopin or a Liszt. They're very, very difficult pieces. Vierne liked to end his organ symphonies with a final movement that he called a grande pièce de concert, just a hugely grand, technically very demanding piece of music along the lines of a Baroque toccata. And yet another famous organist and composer would have been Marcel Dupré from 1886 to 1971. Again, you see him seated there at the console of Saint-Sulpice de Paris. He was a student of and the successor to Charles-Marie Widor at Saint-Sulpice. Now, I could have mentioned a lot more people. Dupré himself went on many organ tours, played the Wanamaker department store organ that I showed you earlier. That was the occasion of one of his most famous improvisations called The Stations of the Cross, another very extremely difficult piece, very modern piece of music to play. There's many other composers that I might have mentioned that have written for the organ. Johann Ludwig Krebs, the last student of Johann Sebastian Bach, probably the last great Baroque style master of Baroque style of music, and particularly organ music. Very interesting music if you ever run across it, some of it bordering on genius. And another famous organ composer would be Felix Mendelssohn Bartholdy. You've all heard of him. So a lot of people have written for the organ. Most people are just unaware that these composers that kind of devoted themselves to the instrument are out there. But anyway, that's it for our little high overview of organ music. I hope that you have enjoyed this, and I certainly hope that all of my talking actually took. So bye-bye, everybody, and we'll see you on the flip side. Bye-bye.